programming and many other things here at the Eastside Freedom Library, is now doing that student life thing while also still being a professor. And so there was a search for a new staff person, and that is me. And so I'm the program and operations manager here. Thank you. I'm a visual artist, former high school teacher, and I have roots in the Chilean resistance movement to the Pinochet dictatorship and the neoliberal process, and that was forced into being in place there through dictatorship. And there have been several recent articles talking about how what is happening right now in the U.S. was basically tried out in Chile in the 80s under the Pinochet dictatorship. So I'm feeling extra, I don't know what the word is, trying to figure out how to make those dots connect for folks and for myself living here within Empire. And so I am super excited to be here with you all and to just welcome you to the space of the Eastside Freedom Library. We have our lovely author and Peter, who will introduce our panel and will be moderating this event. But first of all, just wanted to say we're so happy you're here. Thanks for making it out on a Monday night. I imagine the majority of, just because I'm new, can I see who is also new here? Raise your hands, like first time coming. Oh, okay, we got some new folks, thanks. And who's been here more than twice? Raise your hands. Okay, so a good mix. Awesome. Well, for those who are new to the space, our bathrooms are downstairs, down those stairs. We also have an elevator if you need to go downstairs, and there's a water fountain down there as well. But feel free to ask, approach me with any questions, and also what did you say, space manager? What was the concept that we were working with? David back there is also staff here at the library, so also ask him any questions you may have. So thanks all for coming, and handing it over to our moderator.
Yes, it works. Ben Mackay, come up here, please. Yeah. And Dr. Robinson, come on up here now. Yeah. So we want tonight to be as much of a conversation as possible. I do want to mention too that there is a sign-in sheet, and the library puts out a newsletter once or twice a month, and if you would sign in and give your email, then you'll know what else is coming up. So I'm Peter Ratcliffe, and with my partner Beth Cleary, we were the co-founders of the Eastside Freedom Library back in 2014, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming my old friend Marcus Rediker, and I hope these other three gentlemen are still my friends, because they were not exactly sure they were going to get invited up on the stage. That's what can happen at the Eastside Freedom Library. So you come in to consume knowledge, and you end up participating in producing it. Our featured guest of the evening is Marcus Rediker, who teaches at the University of Pittsburgh, and has been of profound influence on our understanding of the development of capitalism, the enclosure of the commons, the development of transatlantic trade, many things that we got handed in an overly simple way when we were in high school or college, if they were even mentioned. And Marcus has devoted much of the last probably 2 decades to documenting and telling the stories of the resistance to the development. and he's in town in part to speak tomorrow at St. Thomas, and our friend Kanishka is central to making that happen. Marcus, if you don't get enough of him tonight, you can get more of him tomorrow at St. Thomas. And I'm sure all of us are aware of the way the study of American history has been increasingly politicized and threatened by people in power, so that it's not just what we forget to teach or know, but it's also what's being edited out, whether it's the national parks or the Smithsonian. Hello, Honora. Watch out, you could end up here. And I wanted us to have a conversation tonight about the pressures to shape the American history that's being taught to young people, and what kind of scholarship is being developed and activism is being developed to challenge that. So joining us up here to my right, James Robinson, who teaches ethnic studies and black studies at Metro State. Walter Grayson, who teaches in the history department, focusing in African American history at Macalester College, and Ben Mackay, the founder and executive director of the African American Registry. How many of you know about the African American Registry? So you all have homework, if you don't know, to Google it, check it out. It's an extraordinary resource available to everybody who can punch it into the internet. So enough from me. Marcus, you want to start us out?
Thank you, Peter. I want to begin by saying that this is my first time in this place, and I am inspired. I've visited places like this around the world, these places, liberated zones, I call them, places where people can think together. It's a very rare thing these days that we can do that. So warmest regards to Peter and Beth for this stunning achievement. Really delighted to be here. In terms of starting our discussion, I'd like to begin with an observation about the writing of history in recent years. And I'm going to make kind of a big claim, but I'm going to argue that over the last 60 years, okay, the scholarship that has been produced on the issues of race and slavery is better than any other body of scholarship anywhere in the world in that time period. Now, that scholarship was inspired by the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, which made very serious political demands for a new kind of history, right? One that took these subjects seriously. And some of us here are old enough to remember how those subjects were taught or not taught before the mid-60s, when these movements began to grow and affect public consciousness. I mean, I grew up in the South, where we learned about the War of Northern Aggression, in other words, the Civil War. So from the beginning of the writing of more or less professional history in the 1830s up until the middle of the 1960s, and still surviving beyond that, we had the most conservative, whitewashed history. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine how bad it was now. But then these many scholars, hundreds, and now I think by now thousands of scholars, have taken the inspiration of those movements and have produced this magnificent body of scholarship. And now that is under attack. We've finally gotten a much more truthful history of this country, and that is under attack. Now, this is not brand new. I do want to remind you that back in the early 90s, George Bush I called for new American history standards. And a friend of ours, the late Gary Nash from UCLA, took the lead in basically synthesizing what all American historians thought about the recent work on American history. That proposal was sent to the U.S. Senate and defeated by a vote of 99-1. And they told everybody why. Insufficiently patriotic. Which to my mind translates into, we want a history that will make young men and women be willing to go and die in foreign wars. That's the political purpose of historical teaching, and I think that is still the political purpose. But there is a fight, there is a struggle. And in terms of my own work, I write, as does Peter and many others, what's called history from below. The history of the people who built the world we live in, but who are rarely in the history books. Now, this is part of the big achievement, and that we now know a lot about the people who built this country. I was part of a project initiated by Herbert Gutman that wrote a textbook with the title, Who Built America? So I guess what I would say about all this is that this kind of history is on the verge of fundamentally changing the way we see this country and its history. And that's the reason for the intensity of the attack right now. Right now. And there's a lot at stake in this battle. There's a lot at stake. So I could say more about my path to doing this kind of history, but I'd like to hear from other people first.
Well, I wonder, Marcus, if you could just say a little bit about the Maritime Underground Railroad, okay, and which is, your big contribution recently, and how little most of us know about it.
Okay, so I wrote a book in 2007 called The Slave Ship, A Human History, about the nightmarish horrors that took place on slave ships as they carried millions of people from West Africa to the Americas. It was a tough book to write. It was redeemed by the resistance. I mean, even under the most extreme circumstances, people found ways to fight back. I've called the slave trade a 400-year hunger strike, because that was one of the few things people could do. But they also rose up in insurrection. Those uprisings are much more common than we knew, okay? But not long after I finished that book, I began to think about the way in which I had found all this evidence of people escaping slavery by sea in the 30 years before the Civil War. And I thought, I'll write a sequel called Freedom Ship. So the descendants of the people who suffered the horrific Middle Passage through repeated acts of resistance transformed the ship and the sea into places of freedom. And I think this is a powerful thing. And this is a book that's all about resistance. Thousands upon thousands of individual acts. Actually, they weren't individual, I've argued, because you couldn't run away by yourself. You had to have help. You had to work with a sailor or a market woman or a dock worker to get on board that ship. Running away was not an individual act. It was a social and collective act, right? But little did we know that thousands of people were escaping by sea. And that's because this metaphor, and it is just a metaphor, Underground Railroad points us in the wrong direction because, folks, people didn't escape underground, nor did they escape on railroads. So that metaphor focuses our attention on some things, but then occludes from our vision other things. So I found that probably 15 to 20, maybe as many as 25,000 people escaped by sea. That's at least a third, maybe as many as one half of the people who escaped successfully and permanently. And we didn't know anything about it. You know, how did that happen? It's kind of a sociology of knowledge question in here. How were we unable to see this? And I'll give you the quick answer to this. We've got this bias in our heads that history only happens on land. And I made up this word to describe it. It's called it terracentrism. It was kind of half a joke. But it means just land-based history, because we think that history happens only on land in nation states. And then the flip side of that is that the oceans of the world are not real places, and they're ahistorical voids, and nothing happens there. Well, folks, class formation happens at sea, race formation happens at sea, culture formation happens at sea. The struggle against slavery happened at sea, and we missed it, partly because we're just blinded by these categories that we use. So I think this book is, these people made history. These people that we don't know any of them. We know Frederick Douglass and you know Harriet Jacobs. I've got chapters about both of them, but the overwhelming majority of people who populate this book you've never heard of. And yet they exercised what Frederick Douglass called invisible agency. They were agents of history. They were makers of history, even though we couldn't see it for a long time. So partly this book, which is a kind of optimistic and triumphant answer to the previous book, The Slave Ship, right? And I often think, go back to the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s. You think we have it bad today? Look at the power of the Atlantic slave system, and yet these people said no, not going to give in to it. And the cumulative power of their resistance is a major force in creating both civil war and eventually emancipation. We owe a lot to these people. We didn't even know that. We didn't know their names. We didn't know who they were. We didn't know about the kind of resistance they carried out. So to me, this is a very hopeful book for this moment in which we can think about how we can take inspiration from people who have done these things in the past, even though we didn't know about them. But you read these stories and you think, wow, how did that happen? What did it take to make that happen? What kind of courage? And I'll tell you that one of the great joys of writing this book was being in the presence of so many extremely courageous people. Because if these things failed, you know what happened? You could lose your life. You would certainly, at a minimum, lose flesh off your back. And a lot of them failed. But a lot of them succeeded. And that then had a dramatic impact on the development of an abolitionist movement in the North. Right? They are responding to the resistance that they see in places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston, where these fugitives show up. And people there, especially the free black community, said, what are we going to do to help them? We're going to form these new abolitionist organizations called the vigilance committees. So this is a way in which the agency of people, what they did to free themselves, what C.L.R. James called self-activity, of working people to liberate themselves, this actually produced enormous changes in the entire country in terms of how resistance was organized, right? One of the chapters of the book is that a series of maritime escapees transformed the history of abolitionist Boston, which was the strongest place in the country for the movement. They owed everything to these battles that were waged. So I'm just really happy that we have a book now about successful resistance that actually changed the course of history.
Great. Thank you. Someone want to, do we have a volunteer to go next here? Walter, please. Yeah.
I want to make sure I don't yank him.
Cool.
There, I love the way you all have framed the discussion, and again, did not expect to be up here. Thought I would sit in the front row and listen this evening, but I do want to frame my piece of this by saying thank you first to Peter and Beth and echoing the importance of this space. My students find it sacred as they come to visit, even when they can't get in the door. They just are astonished that it exists here, and so thank you. But Marcus, to get me out on a Monday night away from some of the stuff I had to do with my folks, this is the first time we got to meet, was a couple hours ago, and so we've been online together. God, it's almost a decade, right? So I think we met on Twitter, now X, and shared a mission about bringing good history to the public in a way that has been directly attacked by Elon Musk to stop the kinds of things we had been doing for many years. And the work you're describing ties very closely to the reason why I was on X and why folks like Musk have made it a shell of itself, was the work on racial violence and these notions that, for me, when it came up, that most race riots were African Americans destroying businesses in segregated communities in response to police brutality. That the stories of racial violence told in this country ignored this massive history of things like the Red Summer of 1919 and just ignored the terrorism of lynching. And so bringing that to the table, this was something I did in 2017 after the Unite the Right rally when Heather Heyer was killed. Literally in the course of 12 hours, my horror at the event and then writing on that platform how the true history of racial violence had never been told reached, I guess in 2 weeks, about 4 billion individual uses and just changed the discourse. It led to Spike Lee's, Black Klansman, 1619 Project, Stamped from the Beginning, and How to Be an Anti-Racist. All these things spun out of that moment over the next 2 years. And this was where we kind of got together and started saying, okay, every day, what can we put forward to change the public discourse that led to, and we saw in the first Trump term, how this was unfolding. And now we are confronted with a second term where we're now aggressively under attack for having done that kind of work, where most of the things I've done in the last year have been helping people escape if they were in immediate danger from ICE, get to Canada, get to the Caribbean, find ways to kind of follow the tradition that I study a lot now is marinage, the creation of maroon communities where people are outside of the structural legal authority of the state, and how that tradition goes back 3 centuries. And so that's my main starting point here, is that so much of the work that you have done and this extraordinary generation of scholars that go back 50, 60 years, my critique, because of where I started, was that there was still the assumption that slavery was somehow predominantly a Southern phenomenon. And so I had to go back another century into the 18th century and track the way enslavement operated in Rhode Island and the role, as we talked about earlier, merchants as enslavers in shaping the way, not that cotton or tobacco or sugar were grown, but the way that roads were created, the way the very infrastructure that defines what comes to be called the United States is built off of the monetization of African bodies. Insurance companies, banks are all profiting, not from African labor, but the existence of African people as a trade good. And so that's the piece that I'm bringing here, along with what our friend, now departed James Stewart, would remind me to say is I do a ton of stuff on Afrofuturism. And so I had the good fortune 20 years ago to work with a couple writers at Marvel Comics and redesign Wakanda that you ended up seeing in the Black Panther films. And so a lot of my stuff is about not just, it's Sankofa. We look backwards and we look forwards. It's that you can't tell where you are. You must use history to think about what you do next. And so that's the work that I see coming out of this book, and the idea of the freedom ship. It's this place where we mobilize to create something that hadn't existed before, this idea of freedom and liberty that has never been realized. And so that's what makes me most excited to sit and be in conversation today.
Thank you. Ben, would you tell us a little about the registry?
Before I get into the registry, I'd like to piggyback on the book and certain segments of my personal life that come from that book, or the book's main topic, meaning the Underground Railroad. My great-grandmother was the product of a slave master and a slave in Owensboro, Kentucky. And she, because she was fairly light-skinned, was able to learn to read from prescription bottles that were in the kitchen of the home that she was born in. She was allowed to leave to read the Bible to field slaves when they came in after a day's work, and her name was Annie Helm. She had a sister named Cordelia, and Cordelia crossed the Ohio River through the Underground Railroad in roughly 1842. And Cordelia sent for Annie 2 years later. By that time, my great-grandmother had married a man from Mississippi named Isom Ford and had their first child, a gentleman by the name of John Elijah Ford. And so they got into a fake bottom wagon and crossed the Ohio River and got a job at the Kimball Piano Company in Chicago, Illinois, scrubbing floors, and eventually had a home on 37th and Dearborn on the south side. Oral history in my family says that it was the only house that survived the Chicago fire on that block. But I say all that to say this regarding the railroad. I had a chance to be at the Levi Coffin House in Indiana. I've also been to the Jordan House in West Des Moines, Iowa. And in those homes, if you will, to see the struggle of, shall we say, people from my race over the years, it really doesn't bring the question of what do we do in 2025 going forward. It's how do we do it? And the how piece is where, for me, repetition is the key. Repetition is the key. Content about black people, factual content, because there were some black people who were slave traders. All the content needs to be put out in every subject area in a K-12 or even a undergraduate course. And in my mind's eye, that to me is what your book has the capacity to do. I would urge everyone to read it. And I would urge everyone to have their friends read it and pass that along in the way that I answer the question of how do we get this material out there to disarm the onslaught of the 47th president and his administration.
Hello. Wow. Interesting. I guess I have been to the Eastside Freedom Library since it was conceived. Peter and I go back ways, and I owe a lot of my historical training to Peter, and this is an important place that they have created here. I want to piggyback just briefly off of Ben's last point and remind people that Joseph Farr was an enslaved man who came to Minnesota, set up a barber shop in St. Paul that allegedly was a site for the Underground Railroad in St. Paul, downtown St. Paul. My take on this, in some ways, I want to push a little bit on your saying that it was the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement that led this scholarship. I have a PhD in Black Studies, and I believe that it's actually Black Studies and Black Studies scholarship that has pushed the rest of the scholarship on race and slavery over the last 60 years. The importance of having an alternative position in the academy to the dominant white narrative, white scholarship, is important because it then opens up that possibility for other scholars to ask other kinds of questions, whether they are Latino, Native American, Asian American, women, queer. A lot of that comes out of the push for Black Studies. And I've been spending half the afternoon working on a book, and I'm looking at language in particular, and one of the things that your scholarship and others reminded me of was the way in which the language that was created in the slave sailing community is so vitally important to how we begin to resist. Because if we can't talk to one another, if we don't have some shared language in common, then it makes it very difficult for us to both communicate and to organize. And so several concepts, terms have been brought up just tonight: invisible agency, the freedom ship, the Underground Railroad, are all terms, words that did not exist before, just like Black Studies did not exist before 1968, right? It changed the way in which we begin to talk about and think about the world in which we live. The underlying patois, Creole, languages that are created when you have enslaved Africans from many different cultures and countries with different languages that they did not necessarily have a common language, and then interacting with sailors, some of whom were of African descent, some who were British, Dutch, Spanish, etc. You know, that moment when those people came together and began to communicate is a really, really rich kind of area of research and scholarship, right? Because from there you get the possibilities of the maroon communities forming, you know, the escaping from the slave ship, you know, knowing who to talk to and how to talk to them. And I flashed on, you know, that famous passage in Frederick Douglass's, you know, narrative where he begins to learn how to read, by being on the docks in Baltimore, and sharing, words with various people. And so I just want to, highlight, I think, the way in which, language is such an important component to resistance. Prior to my starting working at Metropolitan State University, where I am in the famous Ethnic, Gender, Historical, and Philosophical Studies Department, and one of my colleagues is here tonight, Doug Rossinow, historian. I was at the University of Michigan in the Center for Social Solutions, and we were looking at one of these, what they call those genius grants from MacArthur Foundation, $100 million grants, and I coined a term called the third slavery, because in our conversations around the table, people were talking about modern slavery. They were talking about post-slavery. They were talking about various ways in which slavery is now being practiced. And it appeared to me that we have moved in sort of like a new phase of slavery, right? That, there are enslaved Vietnamese workers on shrimping ships in the Pacific Ocean, right? There are obviously still enslaved female, and we've been hearing about Jeffrey Epstein for a while now, right? That we need to come up with new ways of categorizing and classifying and talking about these events, I think, so that younger people especially have a new vocabulary to use. And so the term that I came across that I think is appropriate to the moment, and I didn't create this one, but I just found it. You know how these things are when you're doing research, sometimes you have these finds, is trumpery. There is a word called trumpery, Trumpery. Trumpery comes from the French, meaning fraud. Fraud. And so, yes. And so there are I think, ways in which, we engage in this conversation and in this discourse, I think that are important, to actually articulating the resistance, not just physical resistance, but, verbal, intellectual resistance as well. And I need to acknowledge the folks from Black Ink who are here, since they help us, put out new words in their publishing company.
Only briefly. Tubman, I was born in Owensboro, and I'm quite moved to hear the story of your family. I think that more than anything I could say, that makes this real to people. So I thank you for that. I do agree very much, James, that the struggle for a new vision of the past must be a struggle for new concepts, new ways of thinking. We get trapped in old ways of thinking. So I really welcome. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Caribbean version of trumpery is called fuckery.
I didn't know that, but
yeah. And to Walter, your impact has been so great in so many different areas that this is a man who tears down intellectual enclosures. We're all meant to stay inside a certain area within the academy, but of course you're not really being an intellectual unless you disrespect those barriers and tear them down. So I do compliment you for that. But most of all, I just want to hear what the people in the room think, because as I said at the outset, this is one of those rare places where we can think together. We don't appreciate that as much as we should.
So I just, while I have the mic, want to tell one story, and that is I grew up in New London, Connecticut, which was the place where the Amistad ship was brought after the rebellion of Cinque and the crew, or the enslaved people overthrew the crew, and the navigator engaged in some fuckery, and the ship and the ship did not go to Africa where Cinque and his mates wanted it to go, but it ended up in New London, Connecticut. I was never told that story as a child. We were never taught that story. I don't know if it's in the curriculum now. We know that, and I don't remember the year that, what's his name, the filmmaker, Spielberg, made his film Amistad. No, thank you, 97. And Marcus knows because he made a movie. He and Tony Buba made a movie where they traveled to Sierra Leone, where Cinque and the other freed enslaved people lived the latter part of their lives in freedom, to discover, and maybe you'll say something about it, but to discover what people in Sierra Leone knew about the story of the Amistad and Cinque. Long after I left New London, Connecticut, the Mystic Seaport collaborated in a project to create a replica of the Amistad and to use that as a teaching device, and it sailed around to various places, and kind of remarkably, a young man, or then a young man, Dwayne Williams, who was a student of mine at Macalester, after he graduated, he got a job on the Amistad as one of the interpreters, and he was on the ship when the project ran out of money in Europe, and he had to find his way back to the United States, and the ship never sailed again as a teaching tool. So there was a moment there where, and the stories that Dwayne would tell is that kids were fascinated to come onto a ship and then to be exposed to that story. Would you say a little bit about the film you made?
Yeah, this is a film called Ghosts of Amistad. It's available on YouTube. Tony Buba and I went with the film crew and with a group of people from Sierra Leone to visit 10 villages where I had learned in my research the Amistad Africans had come from. So what we wanted to find out was how much of the story was preserved in the West African oral tradition. And so we went from village to village. We had a wonderful man who really made all this possible, Tazif Karoma, who was a lecturer in linguistics at Fora Bay College and knew this region very well, knew all of the local chiefs, got us permission to talk to village elders that in each village. In probably half the villages we visited, there was very little surviving memory. In 2 or 3, there was some memory, but in 2 villages, there was a lot of memory. And the story had been passed down, despite the fact that this was a society plagued by civil war, and that kind of violence is what ruptures the oral tradition, right? That you don't see people passing things on from one generation to the next. So we actually went there to learn the things that only the elders knew about the story. And so we made a film about that. And we also looked for the place where the Amistad Africans were imprisoned, a place called Lomboko, which was a slave trading factory. Nobody had been able to find it for a long time, about 50 years. And we found some people in a fishing village on the coast who said, we fish there all the time. You want to go? And we got in their canoes, and they took us through this mangrove swamp to the place where Cinque and all of the others were held before they were loaded onto a slaver and taken to Cuba. And then, of course, they were being transported to another part of Cuba when they rose up and seized the vessel. But here's a really good example of how history from below can be really surprising. 53 people, 49 men and 4 children, on this small vessel off the north coast of Cuba, rise up and seize the ship, and within 18 months, the most powerful people in the world are debating what they've done. The President of the United States, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the Queen of England, the Queen of Spain, they're all debating this. So this is one of those moments where something just kind of caught fire. And so I wrote a book about this called The Amistad Rebellion, and then we did the follow-up film, which was it was really fascinating to talk to people about what was remembered and how.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring that into the room in part as we were talking about what are other ways that stories get told. And so Walter's work on Black Panther, Wakanda, Marcus making a film. Marcus also has been involved, and I can never make up my mind what noun to use, because we slide into calling them graphic novels, but they're not novels. They're history books. Some people call them comics, but graphic history texts. And our mutual friend Paul Buell has been a big part of making some of those. So that's yet another way that stories are being told now. So at Marcus's suggestion, let's hear from you. Questions, thoughts. Camilla's got a microphone.
Yes, I will bring it to you. Figure out how I get to people. I think that's a good point.
First off, I'd like to thank everybody here for sharing your knowledge and stories here. I feel very inspired. One of the things that I was listening, kind of kicking around in my head is history from below and the stories of resistance and language around it. Language in particular really strikes me. I'm turning 30 this month, and when I, going through the American education system, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, so I don't think I got a particularly biased take other than that. One day, Martin Luther King Jr. appeared, and racism was solved. So, no, just a thought here is I'm thinking with language that at best, this sort of ambiguous force came about and people's struggles were relieved, and at worst, history is coded in white saviorism. So I was wondering if anybody here could talk a little bit more about that kind of language and trying to honor how people spoke and how people thought, and trying to connect it with a new generation who is so far removed from either their own history or from the history of others.
Great question. I don't know about the first part of your request, but what I can tell you is I have a master's degree in education psychology, and part of the courses that I took to get that certification revolved around looking at the prefrontal cortex of the human brain. And the prefrontal cortex, for anyone that doesn't know, is the last part of the brain to develop as a child is forming to be birthed. It influences what you see, influences what you hear, what you say, and what you smell. And what you smell, say, hear, and see is influenced by the prefrontal cortex. At the African American Registry, we've got about 7,000 articles that translate into 113 different languages on our website. Calendar-based, so it changes every day for the solar calendar to reflect the current date in the history of African people and those in the diaspora and the continent, people, locations, and episodes. But back to the narrative piece and changing things for young people in particular, but anyone. One of the things that we try to practice at African American registries, we do not use acronyms. We don't believe in BIPOC. We don't believe in the word minority. We don't use hyphens between African and American to water down the African representation in this country. And I think we do that mainly because by using phrases like Black, Indigenous, people of color, or minority, community of color, person of color, what it does is it allows the whiteness to escape the conversation because it's never mentioned. And so what we've done is we replaced those acronyms and things with non-white. Because what I know is if I wanted to get a job driving a bus in St. Paul tomorrow, I would have to check a box. Black, African, Asian Pacific, Indigenous, or something. And under Black and African American, this is Black. This is not Black. So what I know is that by checking that box or by paying attention to BIPOC and things like that, I'm basically acknowledging that I am not white. And I think that is something that would be crucial to put in front as an option for young people in particular to self-identify with and to identify others. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for this panel. I'm still trying to form the question, but I have a close friend who has been across many borders, and he talks about how it is to live not knowing the future, what comes next, not knowing if he's going to be having to pick up and go the next day. And as I was reading your book, Marcus, it was like both Marcus and I were talking about our friends and like the kind of like, where is freedom? The kind of like, yes, we could go there, but then we're also going to confront other things there. And we're having to face those questions a lot these days. And I'm thinking about that. My friend, he said to me, the biggest thing for him has been the friends he's met along the way. And I thought about your book, and I thought, this is a book of friendship. And I just wonder about friendship and the power, I guess, of friendship. The ordinary stories that you tell in that book are just like people being friends to one another. It's not like necessarily heroics. we might have this idea that these are heroic figures, that we could never be like them, but often it's just people befriending somebody, people doing something, So I wonder about the role of friendship, and then I guess this question around, relatedly maybe, around, can we think about movement, freedom of movement, migration, as we've brought up ICE, as we've, trying to think through and beyond the national telling of history, as we're thinking about black studies, and much of black studies emerging out of the Caribbean and C.L.R. James and the kind of the worldliness, the globality of black studies, not just a national history. So those are a lot of questions there, but friendship, migration, yeah.
Friendship is a very good way to put it, and maybe that's a concept I should have made better use of. But I framed it in terms of solidarity. And of course, one of the things that I've learned in studying working people all these many years is that solidarity is an achievement. Solidarity is something that you work to produce. It's not inherent in any situation. Lauda Equiano, the 18th century Nigerian man who worked as a sailor, talked about there were moments when some of his fellow sailors wanted to enslave him, and then there were moments when some of his fellow sailors protected him from that, who showed solidarity. So I think, these moments, what makes solidarity possible? And my answer for this book is common work on the waterfront, in which you know people. Many of these sailors, especially black sailors, are on something called packet ships. They're coming to the same port again and again and again. So they know people. Relationships of trust can be developed. That's another very important part of it. But I would add one other point, right, that people in motion are not like sedentary people. And for the longest time, all of anthropology and culture was built on the false notion that people don't move, right? The search for the sedentary primitive. But of course, those people have been moving for thousands of years, right? And so I think we need a new conceptual understanding for people in motion. Right? And of course, the African diaspora is the best example of this. And I think about your comment, James. On every one of these slave ships, people had to find ways to communicate with each other. Sometimes among people who had been enemies, traditional enemies in West Africa. But now they've got a much bigger problem than that. Right? So new cultural forms emerge in that situation, new ways of speaking, new ways of singing, new ways of dancing, new ways of, imagining what a proper funeral would be for someone on a slave ship. And a group of 8 people on the lower deck trying to figure this out. How do we help this person make the transition into the other world? And that too is an act of solidarity. But I think we need concepts. We need dynamic concepts that help us to understand the material realities of people's lives. And especially for people in motion. I was just at a conference, a No Borders conference, in which I said, let's not call them migrants, let's call them fugitives. Because they are fugitives from something, economic oppression being perhaps the main thing. But I don't pretend to have answers to the big questions that you pose, but I do agree they're really important questions. So thank you.
Yes, please do.
Jump in behind that. I just had the good fortune to give a talk back in February directly related to your question, where we're in a moment where our national federal representatives, people who speak for us on the world stage, want to reinscribe really rigid boundaries and borders, and they want to connect the idea of nation and religion in some deeply retrograde ways to attempt to police humanity, driven by a fear of exactly what you all are discussing. And so this comes up in my talk in the spring as I'm teaching about Kofi Annan and the kind of ways that he reimagines the United Nations. And it was taking it away from what is kind of McAllister's core identity about internationalism, Wilsonian internationalism, this notion that there are civilized nations that must negotiate with each other and decide what will happen for humanity. Annan departs from this and is like, no, we must speak to the actual people, particularly of the newly independent nations, and to begin to foster global community to reduce the underlying sources of conflict. And so he moves towards interventions in East Timor or in Eastern Europe and just re-envisions what the international mission of the UN is. And in trying to discuss that revision, that transformation of who we are as human beings within these nations, I was like, and it's particularly to focus on migrants, refugees, is the notion of transnationalism. And this is this newer area of interdisciplinary inquiry where we're emphasizing the freedoms that are not just existing for people traveling by boat or by train or by plane from place to place, but the very act of historically dispossessing yourself and repossessing yourself as you go and live and have children, and generationally, how do you reinvent your community and your family experience? And so that was the point of my talk, is to move us away from an international sense that is predicated on avoiding war towards a sense of transnational identity that enables us better to pursue peace, that is emphasizing our ability to move freely outside of the borders that we've inherited. And so that's the moment I think we're in. It's why I'm so thrilled to be in Minnesota with the current configuration of the people who represent us. We're struggling towards this just right here in the Twin Cities with any number of groups of refugees who are here attempting to reinvent themselves and repossess themselves and invest here, or generations of folks who have been here for a century or more who are reimagining what community is in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. The main example I end up talking the most about is I was in New Zealand 4 years ago and was astonished to see that when they established their constitution, the indigenous people of the islands forced the British to say the cultures will interact on equal footing. For you Western Europeans to come here and begin to settle, you will also learn to be Maori. You will learn our language, you will learn our culture, you will learn our habits. And that treaty is binding. I don't know if y'all saw a young woman in their legislature a few months ago that stood up and condemned the attempt to undo this treaty. And they rose up as a nation, not just the indigenous people, and said, no, this is who we are as New Zealanders. We are not simply inheritors of the Anglo-Saxon. And so that piece about how do we bring indigeneity back to the heart of who we are as Minnesotans has been a huge piece of talking about ethnic studies. Like, what does it mean to have Ojibwe language instruction for kindergartners in this state? How does that then transform who we are and how we see ourselves? I'll tell you the single biggest one. This will be my last comment. We imagine that northern border as really, really rigid and impermeable. But maybe the first thing I did when I got here was fly up to Winnipeg and see how Manitoba is connected to Minnesota. And just not assume that, oh yeah, well, we're much more in common with Iowa and Wisconsin and the Dakotas. Like, it's just a really reflexive assumption that we inherit. But I was like, no, we need to engage North and the traditions that are represented there. And that's what I mean when I'm saying moving away from the international towards the transnational and valuing our ability to move and escape the trappings that we've inherited.
There we go. Thank you. First of all, thanks for putting this on this event. This is really great. Let me try and formulate my question. One of the things I've really enjoyed about your work, from the Many-Headed Hydra to now, I haven't read the new book, but yeah, not yet, is finding and unearthing these historical rebellions, these resistance movements, and even the kind of quote unquote individual and not actually individual forms of resistance. And one of the things I find the most interesting about them is that a lot of this was happening kind of during the formation of the modern racial order. And so a lot of, in hindsight, we can look back and say, oh, these were multiracial rebellions, or these involved these different groups. But at the time, that might not be the most accurate thing to say, right? And I think because the racial order was relatively new at the time, it kind of made that easier to happen. And I think today, it's a very different story, that resistance movements are plagued by the segregation built into our society. And even when there are these moments like in 2020 where that is kind of very temporarily, briefly overcome a little bit, the racial divisions, and reinscribing those is a very important part of stomping out the fires. And so I don't expect anyone to have an answer to this, obviously, but I guess I'm wondering if there's anything in your studies that from the past that maybe provide some insight on ways that we could think about addressing this in the modern era.
Yeah, it's a really good question and a tough one. It's undoubtedly true, as you say, that the different kinds of resistance that were taking place before modern conceptions of race were established, there was a kind of freedom that came with that. I mean, I was a little shocked to find an Irish man in John Hewson's tavern in 1741 saying, "I pledged to burn the town and kill the white people," which did not include himself, right? So I tried to come up with a concept that would embrace the differences, the cultural differences. Tried to come up with a conception of class that would allow us to think heterogeneity rather than cultural, sort of a monolithic cultural idea. And one of the concepts that actually had a new interesting life in the George Floyd era was the motley crew, which is always about multi-ethnicity, doesn't pretend to stand outside of power relationships, but it describes some new kind of social force that is greater than any particular kind of identity. And I think what I found in my studies is that those concepts will be discovered in the struggle. They don't exist outside of it. And what we tried to show was that in these port cities, in the 18th century, and now this is really critical to freedomship, there was this powerful force of multi-ethnic workers and who did frequently see themselves as part of the motley crew. So like many of these conceptual questions, they'll be solved in practice, or they won't be solved at all. And so, but I guess I'm hopeful about the capacity of movements to create new ways of understanding. And it is true that, and C.L.R. James said this, he said, look, sometimes people are instinctively, although thoughtfully, trying to generate something new, and they don't yet have language for it. I think that's just a basic statement of historical materialism, that the language follows the action in some way. And I guess, what I've discovered is that the kinds of actions that can be taken are vastly greater than we thought. The forms of resistance are vastly greater than we thought. But then what happens in those moments when they coalesce? Nobody saw the George Floyd protests coming. You did? Police kill people in this country every day. But there was something about that event that was so combustible. But yes, please.
I wasn't going to talk about that, but since you brought it up, no, I was actually in Ann Arbor when George Floyd got killed. And I was in my apartment because we were on COVID. And I was reading, but I had the television on with no sound. And I looked up, and the ticker on the screen said something about Minneapolis. And I said, oh, okay. Kept reading. I looked up again, and there's the picture of a police officer arresting, I assumed, this black man, and he was on his back. I went back to reading. I didn't have the sound on, so I didn't know what was going on, right? Like 3 minutes, 4 minutes later, I looked up, and it's like the police officer is still on this man's neck. And I'm like shouting at the television, you're killing him, you're killing him, you're killing him. And then I turned on the sound, like, what's going on? People in Michigan knew I was from Minnesota. I started getting these phone calls. James. I said, watch out. People in Minnesota are not going to take that. Mm-hmm. So I had a inclination, that it turned out the way it did. I couldn't have suspected that. But I wanted to get back to your question because, and somewhat to Mr. Mitchie's point, and to yours as well. I think, there's an assumption that when we talk about race, that we all know what we're talking about. And that we all share the same connotation or denotation, whatever, of the term. And, I don't think we do. And I think education in this country has had a very difficult time dealing with race as a topic. Similarly, the term black, I think, again, is one of those terms that is loaded in ways for different people, and that we don't always share the same take on it. Although I love black ink, so I'm gonna I'm gonna keep saying it. The challenge, that's a challenge even historically, when people write history. Are we using a contemporary use of the terms black or race in the ways that people were using it and thinking about it and writing about it 100 years ago, 200 years ago, et cetera? Because if we're not communicating in their language, then they wouldn't understand what we've written if they were to come back somehow, right? And so I think that's a challenge for historians. I think the other challenge is that, when we conceptualize race, how do we deal with its alternatives? So, as Peter knows, I worked at McAllister and put together an anti-racism training program. And, one of the things that we struggled with was trying to get everyone on the same page. How do we begin talking about anti-racism if we don't share, have some common frame of reference to discuss it? And although I thought it was a successful program, and the college, and belatedly has said it was a successful program. At the time, there was pushback, from members of the campus community about this program. But in that struggle, where we had students, faculty, staff, alumni, community members, all sort of a part of this project, there was this community that was created that became very powerful and very effective in advocating for a new way of at least thinking about, talking about race on campus and in the world.
Well, I want to say thank you, first of all. This is a wonderful panel. There's so many thoughts throughout the whole conversation. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. So there's so many thoughts that's popping into my head right now. I want to say thank you, first of all, to Brother James for even elevating and understanding some of the work we're doing at In Black Ink. One of the things that you said kind of stuck with me as you was talking. You said, and I know the context in terms of we're better off now, and then kind of looking at in the past, like all of the history, all of the things that have passed, but like Elder Mahmoud says, hasn't really passed. And so part of, I think, the issue for me becomes almost like you alluded to, the etymology of the language that we use, the words that we use. Schooling in this country is very surface. Part of my schooling took place in this country. The other part was in Guyana in South America. And I would say that it was probably a little more rigorous, but at the same time, there's a surface dialogue that happens around history specifically as it pertains to the cultural groups or whoever you want to kind of elevate. And so my question in part is, how does, well, all of what you said is just so profound because it reflects what we've gone through, and we're still struggling with it. But at the same time, I really feel like there's pieces of this history that becomes almost like outside of the blanket, the covering that we put on it, where there's not a discussion that happens. Like, for instance, the first thing I noticed, and no disrespect, there's 5 men sitting up here. And, you know, history as it's told in most of the history books are, you know, written by men. And that's one of the things, not that it's wrong, but it's a certain perspective. So you don't have, when we talk about the etymology of the word, we only have a part of that experience that's being presented to us. And then when we look at even some of the terminology, I love that you mentioned terminology, because when we're talking about how things might be better now, it is, I mean, on a certain level, but there's a psychological warfare that has been waged with lots and lots of traumatic outcomes for people from the inception of, you know, these slave ships arriving to current, that I'm wondering, how do we talk about that in historical terms? How do we include some of those nuances so that it's not just on this date this happened, at this time this happened, you know, these two people, you know, was involved? Because it just feels like the reach is so broad. And although it's really good to kind of pull us in and remind us of some of the things that especially this administration is trying to neglect and erase, and, you know, it doesn't give full credence to the weight of what the descendants of these people walk around with on a day-to-day basis. and the people on both sides, because I think white people have to white people in, quotes, because there's no such thing, like you said, you're not black, but, there's things we have to deal with. So how do we include those nuances?
A couple of us were recruited impromptu at the last minute, and when I saw you walk in the door, I was gonna like, well, why don't you come and sit up here? But I didn't want to do that to you. Okay. I've been involved with 2 institutions now that in some ways have been impacted by the latest administrative regime. I was a part of the AP African American Studies group and helped formulate that curriculum. And then I worked at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And actually, I just had a conversation with one of our students, our shared students, who is now interning at NMAHC today, and she's doing well, Mate. Yeah. Except for the okay, the government shut down in layoffs, but you got it. At both institutions, there were internal challenges as well as sort of the external environment. One of the struggles I thought with the AP African American Studies curriculum was that they were trying to do too much. And in part that was because you had 200 some scholars who have very different sort of philosophical, ideological, theoretical, conceptual kind of backgrounds. And so people were pushing for different ways in which the history should be told, and feeling that certain things were really important to them. And I felt that, there need to be a measuredness, because my Iowa experience, I went to grad school in Iowa, was my first time actually interacting with Republicans. I mean, I knew that they existed, but I'd never had a conversation with a Republican until I moved to Iowa. And I'm like, oh, you all are real. And don't get me wrong. I mean, everyone has their right to believe what they believe. But when you start talking to people who have a very different frame of reference, you begin realizing that some of the things that you want to say, you can't say in the same way. And so then you need to adjust and figure out ways to tell the story so that they can hear it too. And then, the current attack on history, I wrote this piece to the current occupant in the White House. I haven't sent it to him. Because I'm like, you're attacking the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and you can just get out of your office, your home, and walk the 2 blocks over to that building and actually go through it and see for yourself, rather than taking the word of who knows who about what goes on in that museum. And he hasn't done that, and that's the kind of ignorance that we are often confronted by, whether it's Black studies or African American studies or Black history, African American history. You have people who assume that they know because they hear the words, and therefore they make assumptions based upon, not upon content, not upon doing the research themselves, but about, some stereotype, some image, mental image that they have around these concepts. And that's a challenge. But that's why Dr. Rediker's books are so important, I think.
Thank you, James. President Trump did visit the museum during his first term, and as he was leaving, it became clear that he thought the founder of the museum, Lonnie Bunch, was Frederick Douglass.
I know why.
You heard that story.
I haven't heard that story.
No, it's real. I heard it from Lonnie.
Okay.
So there's your point,
Yeah.
right? That's a really profound question. How do you teach? How do you write? How do you educate to try to make the depth of that violent experience possible for people to understand? Walter used the word terror. And slave ship was an instrument of terror. People were ruled through terror. Didn't always work. But to me, this is such an important thing to understand in a country where we talk about terror all the time, but not the terror that helped to build this country, right? So, I can only say I've done the best I could with the studies the subjects that I studied. I don't know. It's not for me to judge how well they convey any of that. But I do think it's important that we all try to do it. That we try. To me, it just comes down to a fairly simple matter of trying to tell the truth about what happened. One of the things I wrote against in writing this book, The Slave Ship: A Human History, were these statistical models of the slave trade, which sanitize all the history and get you to focus on the fact that only 13.9% of the people died on any given voyage. Well, that's like 1 out of every 7 people whose dead body is thrown over the rail every morning to the sharks that trailed the slave ships. That's the difference between abstract knowledge and concrete knowledge is powerful. And we need to tell the real story of slavery and all of its different dimensions in as concrete a way as we can. And I think there have been hundreds and hundreds of books that have tried to do that. But there still remains this tremendous gap between what's in those books and what people are willing to hear. That's a big part of it. Part of this is just we don't want to know. I mean, the slave ship generated a lot of hate mail. I expected it, because if you deal with a subject in which there's been a lot of repression, that's going to happen, right? So I wish I had a better answer to your question, but I think it's kind of the biggest question in a way moving forward. How will we write a history that can help people to understand the world we live in now? But many people are going in the opposite direction. They want to go back to the 1950s and that whitewashed history.
Yeah, go ahead, James.
How many people have been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture? I strongly recommend that you go. It is an incredible experience. It tells an incredible story. It literally takes you to the depth of the story, because they encourage people to initially go to the elevator and you go down 3 stories as if you're going into the belly of a slave ship. That was the concept that we worked on. And then you go for a 1.5 mile journey through exhibits, display cases, dealing with the slavery experience. Okay, that is a powerful exposure to some of the realities of slavery. And then so you're coming up 3 floors, but it's a gentle climb. But then the top 3 floors of the museum talk about what happened after that. And to go to see the efflorescence, if you will, of the culture, in so many different forms. Obviously, music, fashion, movies, and to see what this people who had for 250 some years been oppressed create in 100 years' time, it's mind-boggling. It is a joyful explosion of the human spirit, if you will. So I've been there several times, and just so you know, there is also, once you come out of slavery, if you need to decompress, there is this wonderful room that is just a waterfall and a reflecting pond where you can kind of sit and ponder what you had experienced and really kind of let go of some of the experience, and because there is pain for some of us in working through slavery. I know one of the things that I tried to do years ago was, to try to go back imaginatively to what it must have been like to have been enslaved, to have been on a slave ship, to have had to wear chains. What did that feel like? How did that impact how you felt, how you thought, how you spoke, how you looked at the world, how you interacted with people around you? And just to the material reality of it, I was in a discussion with a Macalester student when I was a student at Macalester, a white female who was talking about how enslaved women were and how oppressed women were. And finally I said, "So how heavy was the chain?" And she looked at me like, "What?" Because if you've been enslaved in this country, you know that there were chains. You know that there was other kinds of violence done to the human body that you don't forget. The stigmata are still there.
Just tack on to that a little bit, just because I have 2 opposite extreme answers for you. I'm going to preface this by saying these resources are free for everybody online. The one is from the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. It's a 350-year history of that state and its debt to the enslaved people that have lived there. For me, it's a miracle that it exists. Like, the denial of Northern slavery has been a huge obstacle. But at the other end of that extreme, so I mentioned this viral thread I put up online, and how do I teach people to confront the monstrosity? So I built this course in 2002 for Drexel called Collective Racial Violence. It's a 10-week class. Did 2 books, well, 1 book on lynching, 1 book on rioting, and then an overview of the arc of racial terrorism. And By the end of the third week, it was a night class. Students were weeping openly in the class. They just couldn't process anymore. I don't think we had gotten to the Civil War. Then another 3 weeks, so week 6 out of 10, students were leaving the room and vomiting. Like, it was a traumatic experience that made me leave teaching it and say, I got to break this into multiple classes. I can't do this all in one condensed piece. And when I came back around and put it all up as a thread online, just in reaction to Unite the Right, the one thing that hit everybody was Mary Turner in 1918. Folks know the story of Mary Turner? There are no really young people in here. Good. Turner's husband is lynched, and then 2 days later, she is lynched for protesting her husband's killing. She was 8 months pregnant. They cut the child from her belly and killed it before they killed her, and was covered in the newspapers, and just one of the most gruesome incidents. I don't know anybody who comes across the evidence and is just like not horrified by the depth of the evil. And it's not singular. Like, you go back and you trace in slavery, it's over and over and over again. Like, this is a recurrent action. And so the way that I got that out to people, it was a variety of different kinds of websites, but video was tremendously powerful in showing people just an interactive way. It wasn't just reading the text. And that's the lesson that I took forward on the opposite end, was art is what makes this connect, and to a certain extent music. When I get to use recorded sound in combination with visual art, and I feel you for being a visual artist, it is such a powerful gift to give in a center like this. 2 years ago, New York City asked me to put together a graphic history, and that's what I call these things. So it's not a novel. A graphic history of hip hop for the 50th anniversary. And they wanted it for high schoolers, maybe down to 8th graders. And so I found a really good artist who I'd been working with on other stuff, and he put together a 20-page comic. And we put it out in November of 23. And so we trained the teachers how to teach it. They put it up online. They could download it all for free. They gave it to every school in New York City. When we went to the first middle school to show them copies and deliver the first set, the kids flipped the tables over and stormed us. They nearly knocked us all to the floor, demanding more of it. The joy of discovering a history that resonated with them and helped them feel like they could take charge of their education, it was so intense that we left there and we're like, okay, we need to make this bigger. And so we expanded it to like 90 pages, and like 6 months later, like it was the #1 Amazon bestseller for like 4 months, and we still get swarmed by people demanding more. We have another volume coming. But like the combination, and this is the formula, was we built it around the music, so that every page you're kind of hearing a very familiar song that conjures a certain kind of memory. And then the art gives you a way to visualize the historic moment, so it feels like you're immersed in it. And then we deliver the textual history and the interpretation and the analysis of what was happening in the moment. To do this with your books, I'm kind of terrified at the ways this would resonate with people. But that is the answer. It's like, I'm sitting here and I'm like, would I ever dare try to do something around Mary Turner using art and sound? Like, I'm honestly fearful about what would happen if people had to really sit and engage with that. But it's the kind of thing that we need.
Well, I want to call this formal conversation to a close. There are copies of Marcus's book, courtesy of Subtext Books, and I suspect Marcus would be willing to sign them. So there's that. Kanishka, can you tell us time and place tomorrow?
7 o'clock at McNeely Hall, which is on Sun Avenue, room 100.
7 o'clock tomorrow, McNeely Hall at St. Thomas. We've had a couple of shout outs to In Black Ink. Look them up on the internet. African American Registry, check that out. Marcus, how many graphic histories have you now produced?
We've produced 3.
Uh-huh.
One about Benjamin Lay, the radical Quaker abolitionist, who was only 4 feet tall, had dwarfism. One about pirates, based on a book I wrote called Villains of All Nations. One about the New York uprising of 1741, the Motley Crew, and we've just finished one on the Amistad Rebellion, but that won't be published until June. So inadvertently, we've created a History from Below graphic history series.
Excellent. Excellent. And let's show some love for the panelists. Yeah. They didn't have a chance to prepare, but the knowledge comes through. So, and thank you all for coming. Let me just say, Will Cooley, what is your event here?
Invitation only, Peter.
Oh, it's invitation only.
Housing for people with criminal records.
Ah.
It's a policy. Invitation only. Let's get some legislation together. Wow.
Okay, so another use of the space.
Yeah.
And I want to thank my colleague David McAllister for recording this so other folks will hear this. The recording will become available on the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channel. And Camila, thank you for your welcome. And a QR code. What happens from the QR code?
Anyone would like to donate to the
Donate on the QR code. I won't make fun of it. All right. Yeah. I'm waiting to see tattoos of QR codes. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Don't rush to leave. If you heard something you want to follow up with, please do.